So, this morning, I'd like to talk a bit about training with open hands. And open hands have a particular kind of memory for me all the way back to when I very first started going to the Berkeley Priory. You know how different ways of expressing things kind of go, I don't want to say in style, but they're popular for a time and then they fade. And this is something I haven't heard a lot in the last 10 years. But there was a lot of talk at that time about if you're having a really tough time, just offer it up. I thought, being new to Buddhism, whoa, it's like I'm having a tough time, However, the open hands is something I've remembered ever since then. I'd like to start just by having everybody, this is an audience participation event here. What I'd like you to do is put your hands in your lap, close your fists, close your eyes, and I'm going to count to 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Open your hands. Keep your eyes closed. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now you can open your eyes. I'm hoping you felt the difference. I always do. So on the very simplest level, training with open hands, you can just do that. You may not know what else to do. You can just do that. Because this is going to train your mind, train your body. Train us to let go. Imagine your entire body being a clenched fist. I'm sure you've experienced that. It's not fun. The problem with trying to train with clenched fists is two important things you can no longer do. You can't give anything. Hard to give with a clenched fist. I suppose unless it just occurred to me that, people do give things with a clenched fist, but they aren't nice. We're also unable to receive. And that means that as long as we're in a condition, and we're now going to consider the clenched fist being our little clenched self, that as long as we're clenched, we also can't receive anything. Which is, I think, part of the reason why when we're in a grumpy, cranky, angry state of mind, we feel distant. We don't feel close to people around us. We just automatically distance ourselves. So we're not able to practice with a clenched fist. We're not able to practice receiving. We're not able to practice gratitude any longer. When it's clenched and your hand is not open, you also can't give anything. So the practice of generosity is denied us. So in essence, when our body is in the state of a clenched fist, we've cut ourselves off completely from others around us, except in angry little snippy ways and things like that. But we'll get into that later. We're also, when we're in a clenched fist position, we can no longer forgive. So what does that lead to? How many of you are familiar with having grudges come up that over something somebody did 15 years ago, and there's that little clenched fist. So training with clenched fists is all about me, mine, I. Everything has to do with those kinds of pronoun references, because that's where our focus is. I'm not getting something. On the other hand, with open hands, we're able to live as we. We're able to consider things as ours. We think of all of us instead of me. Now, the piece about receiving. You remember, just offer it up. When our hands are open, we're also able to receive things which are difficult. This isn't the pleasure of receiving a big hug from a friend you haven't seen in 100 years, but it's the receiving of something which is here to help in one way or another, although we may not think of it that way, but everybody has to come up with their own way of thinking of being able to receive that which is unwelcome. You know, when you sometimes look at your calendar and you realize that you've agreed to do 4 things that you'd rather just not do at all, immediately, whether you know it or not, yourself is constricting. Because you know how impossible it seems to even do the simplest thing that you've promised to do, and when you do it, you've actually finished in 10 minutes, and it was kind of all that for nothing. One of the big things that I think is important for all of us, we'll never finish doing this next thing I'm going to talk about, but we have to do it every day. And that's letting go of, I've got a list, our stories, our discriminations, our jealousy, our old angers, our fears, our anxiety. How many more stories do you have when those are the subject, rather than harmony, peace, joyousness? You know, for some reason, the list of, I guess I would say, negative thoughts is a lot harder to dissolve than remembering how wonderful it was to see somebody who came to see you. Well, you enjoy it, but 5 years from now you don't remember that as much as you would remember the angry comment they made. So somehow this clenchedness is something we wire into ourselves from quite an early age. The reason I showed you these 2 faces is those are 2 people who live from joy. And that's what their book is about. Which is what can happen if we learn to live all the time with open hands. There's an unfortunate truth, and that is, as long as we are alive, people around us will always say or do things in ways that we react to by closing our heart. Things that we don't like. We react to things with irritation and anger. We call them rude. We call them selfish. We call them stupid. We call them careless. Not out loud, but these scripts are running. We react with envy, competitiveness, and contempt. That's one of the things that I saw from this book, and perhaps it's not new, but someone in there said that we have this tendency that if we consider someone to be above us, then we can regard them with envy. If they are our equals, then we can fall into competitiveness. And if they're below us, we can regard them with contempt. And that kind of set me back on my heels, because it's painful to think that I think in ways like that. But all you have to do is this. My favorite one is, I've told this story before, when I was coming here for stays as a lay resident, a man came and was staying for a brief time, and I'd never met him before. And we were having medicine meal in the guest house. And he took everything that was for medicine meal and tore it up into bits and put it in his bowl, and then poured milk all over it and stirred it up and made this huge mush, and then started eating it, kind of going, it was loud and it was, visually. And I found out later that he was a long, long time congregation member here who had been experiencing a succession of cancers in different part of his mouth. And he'd had surgery on his mouth because the cancer had spread to his mouth. That the man could sit there and get up here, for a retreat and actually eat was a miracle. It was a medical miracle. But you know what my little mind thought. Who is this slob? And that's kind of an extreme example, but how many times does somebody do something and you start bristling, and then you discover actually they weren't doing what you thought. They were doing something incredibly kind, only your mind didn't choose to look at it that way. Happens all the time. We react a lot. We clench out of fear, out of helplessness, out of insecurity. We don't want to be hurt. We don't want to be left out. We don't want to be ignored. We are so tender. But are we, really? I don't think so. Sometimes we feel at the mercy of others or at the mercy of the world, that we have no control over conditions. And so we walk around in a permanent state of kind of like being on guard, because what's going to come at me, I don't know. As you can see, I could probably talk for the next hour about all the things that make us lose the virtues that we're trying so hard. I have trouble using that word virtue. It always sounds I don't know, kind of prissy, I guess I would say. It's but that, in fact, that's true. It's what we're trying to cultivate, our helpful virtues. And we continually, with our clenched body and mind, throw obstacles in the way all the time. I don't want this, I want that. It goes on and on and on. My favorite one is the mind that says, don't they know any better? Didn't their mother teach them not to do that? But it doesn't matter what, we all have our own sort of cocktail of negative emotions that keep us in that state of tightness. Separation is what we're trying to create. Protection. So, what can we do? we can actually do a lot, and we already are. But the first thing I'd like to mention is the meditation that, of course, is the core at what we do. But how often do we think of surrendering to meditation? It isn't that we aren't practicing meditation, but are we completely, is every cell of your body like this? A lot of times you hear people use the phrase of, I need to make more effort with my meditation. Well, effort is a bit of a tightness. I don't know, maybe there's a way of extremely relaxed effort, but I haven't found it personally. But there's something about just sitting on the cushion and saying, here I am. Here I am. I want to see. When we surrender, what we're actually also doing is surrendering to the immensity of existing in a place where there's room for all of us. People use a lot of ways of talking about that immensity that exists, but in the greatest sense, that's surrendering to us, whoever we may be out there or in here. No borders, no boundaries. Aside from meditation, I'm a big fan of taking time for reflection. For starters, reflection on the day, reflection on the things that I said or did which were unkind or, not skillful, maybe even abrupt. But not just looking at what happened that causes me to slightly cringe. Looking at things that I actually feel like I was successful at during the day. Sometimes you have to have a difficult conversation with someone and you would do almost anything to avoid having to have that conversation. And at the end of it, you say to yourself, well, what was all that about? And I think it's really important to start building up stories about things that went well. We have to put something in the space that's going to empty out when we we get rid of all the stories that we just recite to make ourselves feel bad. And then the last thing, of course, in the reflection is what could I do better? But on a regular basis, I think, for me at least, it's as important as sitting down in meditation. Another thing I also reflect on is, when you're sitting on your cushion and things want to come into your mind and something keeps coming, that's a thing to then have this time to actually deal with it. What is it that the mind is trying to bring to your attention that seems to be kind of, at least to your mind, quite important? Reflection is a time to take a look at what, if anything, today was I hanging on to? Was I unwilling to let a conversation end because whoever I'm talking to, I feel, doesn't clearly see this excellent point that I'm trying to make? What am I afraid of? If you're going to have a difficult conversation with someone, are you afraid? How much time today did I spend focused on number one, as opposed to us? How much time did I spend thinking about what I want, I need, I should have, and how much can I see beyond. It's as though for the rest of my life all I can see is the people in the front row, and never consider that the people in the next row are just as important. I'm back to all acceptance. It seems like every time I give a Dharma talk, I end up talking about all acceptance. But all acceptance is living with your hands open. Absolutely open. But it's not passive. Pardon me, I couldn't figure out what I was trying to say here. It's learning to live with conditions without complaint, which can be transformational. Learning to not say that one last little thing that I think needs to be said. You know, if you and I have an interchange, do I have to always say the last thing to make sure you clearly understand what I meant? Am I willing to walk away with that, what feels like uncertainty, but actually is nothing more than reality? I mean, my adding my own little 2 cents at the end isn't going to change anybody's mind, that's for sure. But it'll make me feel better, which of course is the most important thing. All acceptance is the only way to actually make possible an unclenched heart. And we often fall on one side or the other when we think about acceptance. Either we're accepting things, we need to work harder to be willing to accept offerings from others. Some people find that very difficult. They love to give, but... And the other side, of course, is with an open heart, accepting what we don't want. What we don't want to happen. What we don't want to have. As I was making notes for this talk, I found how often I found myself only talking on the accepting difficult things. You know, all acceptance. Immediately my mind would go to accepting that which is difficult. And my mind didn't automatically go to accepting what is pleasant and what is nice and what is enjoyable. But believe it or not, there are people who have a great deal of difficulty with that. Living with resentment and fear, anger and envy, irritation, annoyance, mental pain, that's what suffering is. Someone else belching at the table or slamming the door is not suffering. But quite often we react even stronger to something like that we think people shouldn't be doing. That they're negative habits, people who interrupt you, all of these things that, you know, again, didn't your mother teach you anything? We treat those with, I don't say we treat those with the same mind that we would if it was really suffering. That is our suffering. You know, when we're irritated by someone else, we're not happy. All of these little daily clenched fist emotions that we go through are not the feelings of a serene, relaxed, easygoing person. And they're painful. What I'd like to do is end with just a few things out of this book that someone gave us, and I've been reading every morning for a while. This is the Book of Joy, and it was published just a couple of years ago, I think. The Archbishop Desmond Tutu went to Dharamsala to visit the Dalai Lama, and they spent a week together talking about joy. You know, whether there were other people there as well, including the person who actually wrote the book. They did some filming of it, and I don't know what they will eventually do with that. But it's, if you're ever looking for a good book when you go to the library, I recommend this one. So I'd like to read a couple of things which really hit me. The first one, if I can find it, this is going to be Archbishop Tutu speaking. And he's talking about his dear friend, Nelson Mandela. And he says, you know, when Nelson Mandela went to jail, he was young, and you could almost say bloodthirsty. He was head of the armed wing of the African National Congress, his party. He spent 27 years in jail, and many would say, 27 years? What a waste. And I think people are surprised when I say no. The 27 years were necessary. They were necessary to remove the dross. Or is it dross? I never know how to... dross? The suffering in prison helped him to become more magnanimous, willing to listen to the other side, to discover that the people he regarded as his enemy, they too were human beings who had fears and expectations, and they had been molded by their society. And so without the 27 years, I don't think we would have seen the Nelson Mandela with the compassion, the magnanimity, the capacity to put himself in the shoes of others. That's a lot, you know. But I suspect what may have happened, I mean, the one thing that I meant to mention and I didn't, is when calamities are, you know, really horrible things are what are landing in our open hands. The remedy that we have is that we can always take refuge in just doing one thing, the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. How else could you manage 27 years? If we let ourselves get lost in worry and anxiety and fear about what's going to happen next week, next month, just do the next thing. Which is exactly what you do if your hands are open anyway, right? So the other piece I wanted to read is the Dalai Lama speaking. We lost our own country and became refugees, but that same experience gave us new opportunities to see more things. For me personally, I had more opportunities to meet with different people, different spiritual practitioners like you, and also scientists. This new opportunity arrived because I became a refugee. If I remained in the Potala, in Lhasa, I would have stayed in what has often been described as a golden cage for the Lama, the holy Dalai Lama, the spiritual head of the Forbidden Kingdom. So personally, I prefer the last 5 decades of refugee life. It's more useful, more opportunity to learn, to experience life. Therefore, if you look from one angle, you feel, oh, how bad, how sad. But if you look from another angle at that same tragedy, that same event, you see that it gives me new opportunities. So it's wonderful. That's the main reason that I'm not sad and morose. There's a Tibetan saying, wherever you have friends, that's your country. And wherever you receive love, that's your home. And I'm not going to add anything to these 2 men except to say that we can do that too. I doubt any of us will ever face anything. I mean, we won't be facing 27 days in jail, hopefully, instead of 27 years. Or the horrendous conditions that Nelson Mandela found himself in before he went to jail and the things he was fighting for. But they show us that it's possible, and it's not only possible, it's possible for them to get together for a week and talk about joy. Thank you very much.